Now it's on. How exciting. I haven't had a microphone since the opening. Hello, welcome to our first event in the talk series for Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer. I'm Kenny Fries, one of the curators of the exhibit. And I'm going to introduce to you Carrie, special guest for the evening. And I just realized, that I can't see anything because I don't have my reading glasses. I have not done many public events in the last 2 years, so okay, now I can see. I can't see you, but I can see this. Okay, Dr. Carrie Sandahl is professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago in the Department of Disability and Human Development, where she heads the program on disability art, culture, and humanities, which is devoted to research on and the creation of disability art. She co-directs Chicago's Bodies of Work, an organization of art and culture. Her research and creative activity focuses on disability identity in performance and film. Sandahl's publications include a co-edited anthology, Bodies in Commotion, Disability in Performance, which garnered the Association for Theater and Higher Education's Award for Outstanding Book in Theater Practice and Pedagogy in 2006. Her collaboratively created documentary, Code of the Freaks, is a critique of disability representations in cinema and premiered in 2020. Carrie Sandahl coined the phrase on which our exhibit is based in her essay, Queering the Crip or Cripping the Queer, Intersections of Queer and Crip Identities in Solo Autobiographical Performance. In the exhibit introductory text, we quote from this article. Sexual minorities and people with disabilities share a history of injustice. Both have been pathologized by medicine, demonized by religion, discriminated against in housing, employment, and education, stereotyped in representation, victimized by hate groups, and isolated socially, often in their families of origin. Sandahl points out those who claim both identities may be best positioned to illuminate their connections, to pinpoint where queerness and cripdom intersect, separate, and coincide. You might not know about the vibrant disability art scene in Chicago. We have 3 Chicago-based artists in the exhibit. But even if you're not familiar with the vibrant disability art scene in Chicago, you should know that if not for Carrie Sandahl, this vibrancy would more likely not be as vibrant. I first met Carrie at the 1995 conference with the unfortunate title, This Ability, held at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. 2 years later, Carrie showed up in Milwaukee when I was on book tour. As Carrie and I often talk about, we came of age in disability culture in a time before the internet. Email was not prevalent. Imagine that. Finding fellow disabled artists was not easy. It took a lot of work. But Carrie and I found each other, and we found many others, including the writer Ann Finger, who is in the Berlin audience tonight, and have stayed in touch for the past decades. In 2021, Carrie was producer of the Chicago episode of Perel and My Virtual, and Perel is also in the audience. It was virtual because of the time of the pandemic where nothing could happen live. The version of Life Unworthy of Life, a queer disc Crip talk show, season 3, episode 1, Chicago and on the Zoom ramp of the universe, which you can view online. You can also watch excerpts from previous seasons of the show in the exhibit. Over the decades, Carrie Sandahl remains one of my go-to Crips to talk about art, accessibility, and anything else that's on my mind. She is not only brilliant, but she is also approachable and humane in ways we don't often experience in our polarized and competitive world. Carrie Sandahl is a person of unique grace. As soon as I knew we would have an event series for the exhibit, I knew I wanted Carrie to start it off, and this way I knew she would experience the exhibit live. She is one of the most outstanding humans I know, and I am honored that she begins our Queering the Crip event series tonight.
Thank you so much. Is the microphone working? Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so good evening. Thank you to everyone who made this evening's event possible, especially co-curators Kenny Fries and Birgit, help me with the pronunciation, who invited me, and project manager Karina Kloblauer, who arranged for my visit. The Schwulz Museum's current exhibition, Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, clearly and powerfully explores how bodily and moral ideals are deeply intertwined. Together, they are encoded in artistic representation that the exhibition traces from the ancient Greeks to today. Western societies must constantly police the boundaries of these ideals through acts of social exclusion, discipline, and even the extermination of outliers. The exhibition's featured artists directly challenge these ideals and practices based on perspectives of living their lives as disabled people whose very existence is considered a threat to them. That threat is not limited to disabled people's existence as individuals, but also extends to the possibility of propagation through contagion, sexual reproduction, and supposed moral impurity. I am honored that the exhibition takes up some of the terms and concepts from an academic article I wrote for the Gay and Lesbian Quarterly in 2003 that also explored the work of artists with disabilities and non-normative sexualities. 2003, it dawned on me that is nearly 20 years ago, almost a generation. So I've been invited to share with you some reflections on key terms and concepts from that article and some of my current work as an artist, activist, and academic. I offer these reflections on how some of the terms and concepts originated, evolved over time, and resonate in our current cultural moment. I will begin today's talk by giving you a sense of the big picture that informs a disability perspective. Then I move through a series of 5 snapshots in time that illustrate aspects of each concept as they build upon one another. Each snapshot varies in scale and level of magnification. My hope is that taken together, these snapshots enrich your navigation through the exhibition, as well as offer points of entree into the discussions that it raises. So before we get to the snapshots, let's start with the bigger picture. In both my creative and my scholarly work, I'm interested in the ways that disabled people formulate their identities and their communities through the arts. Disability identities are unique in that they coexist in every other demographic category, such as race, class, gender, sexuality, age, religion, nationality, basically anything you can think of. And to complicate matters even more, disability can include any type of impairment: physical, mental, sensory, neurological. And despite its ubiquity and infinite variability, the category of disability means something. It can mean everything. Disability means something and everything to how people with impairments experience the world. While disability means something and everything at the same time, it's helpful to look at just one part of the big picture, but with the understanding that so much is left out. I mean, there's no possible way you can talk about everything and something all at once, right? So the question for me is, how does the arts give disability specific meanings to disability identity, to disability community formation? And given disability's variability, how does art pinpoint the specificities of an experience while at the same time doing the vital work of making connections across difference? Oops. As I have explored these questions over the course of my career, is this echoing? All right, let me know if it gets too echoey. As I've explored these questions over the course of my career, the biggest task for me has been to name and describe phenomena as they take shape around me. My 2003 article zoomed in on 3 elements of disability identity configuration. I was looking specifically at disability, gender, and sexuality. While these elements are, of course, informed by race, religion, etc., for that article and for most of today's talk, I'm going to limit the conversation to these 3 elements. My article was written during a time in which disability experience was going through a seismic change in the United States. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, the disability rights movement in the US had begun enjoying the fruits of its labors, leading up to and during the implementation of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which provided millions of Americans access and accommodations in public offerings, including the arts and education. Though the movement had succeeded in refiguring disability from being solely an individual medical one to a collective legally recognized minority group with civil rights protections, disabled people were still grappling with what it meant to be a minority group with a shared culture and identity. Rather than a hodgepodge of people with impairments that didn't seem to have any particular connection. And the arts played a vital role in helping figure out what that was and could be. At disability activist and art gatherings, disabled people shared their stories with one another, naming oppression, claiming pride, witnessing each other's struggles, and redefining disability on our terms. Disabled artists engaged in storytelling as solo autobiographical performance artists were intentionally giving shape to disability identity, not only for themselves as individuals, but also were by extension creating community with the audiences they gathered, much like we have here today. Through their stories, they offered vocabulary for describing our experiences, proposed values around which we could coalesce, and offered challenges to ways of thinking that furthered oppression. I noticed that many of the solo artists were also gay or lesbian, and many of their stories addressing both aspects of their identities. I was like, is this a thing? Maybe its own genre? So not only did I notice that a genre was taking shape, but I had noticed that these gay and lesbian artists told stories that were not necessarily focused on assimilation or mere acceptance into mainstream society. These artists wanted rights and accommodations, yes, but they also claimed value in their outsiderness, their edginess, their difference. To name and describe this genre, I needed more specific language that captured these artists' insider-outsider status and representational strategies. Additionally, not only were these artists outsiders from the mainstream, they also claimed a certain outsiderness to both gay and lesbian communities and the disability communities in which they belonged. As such, they were uniquely situated to point to the homophobia that was inherent in disability culture and to ableism that was in gay and lesbian cultures. Several of the terms I used to describe these performers in my article were easy to find since they were widely in circulation at the time. To describe sexual outsiders, queer, and radical disability activists, crips. It was even easy to find a term to describe the performance techniques used to point to and to deconstruct heterosexist social structures. The verb to queer or queering, as that was a theoretical concept and practice already in circulation. But what was not easy to find was a term to describe the performance techniques the artists were using to point to and deconstruct ableist social structures. So I invented one, the verb to crip or cripping. So now that we have a sense of the big picture, we're going to zoom in further on these key terms and concepts in the snapshots. And as we zoom in, I want to scroll back further in time to my own Crip origin story as a means of illustrating how, as the disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers and other post-positivists have reminded us, lived experience begets theoretical insight. Insight that is tested and modified based on comparing one's perspective to the experience and perspectives of others. By becoming specific, we can get a better sense of the bigger picture. So these are the 5 snapshots of how identity can be a process of accrual and demonstrates that the timing and availability of ways of understanding is constantly under revision, making possible newer and more complex understandings of the world. So the 5 snapshots are cripple, terra incognita, queer and queering, crip cripping, queer queering, and queering the crip and cripping the queer. Whew, that's a jumble, so we're just going to take it one at a time. Okay, the first snapshot, cripple. The term that precedes the term crip. As a physically disabled person whose childhood was in the late 1960s and 70s, the word cripple was seared into my being as a diagnosis, a humiliation, a reason to exclude, and paradoxically, a sense of belonging, pleasure, pride, and power. Doctors used the term as a neutral diagnostic descriptor for people with orthopedic disabilities. I had surgeries, castings, and braces at the Carrie Sandahl Hospital for crippled children, and later at the Oregon Health Sciences University's Hospital for Crippled Children in a division in Portland. Schoolyard bullies used the term as a weapon hurled to hurt and humiliate. And sometimes adults used the term as a reason to exclude me from participating in educational and recreational activities for my own good, of course, because I was crippled. The word cripple not only designated me, though, as an outsider, it also named my belonging in the community of disabled children, girls in particular, in the hospitals. We raced wheelchairs, we had parties, we developed, frankly, bad attitudes. We developed a snarky, wicked sense of humor to disarm the pain of those who would patronize us, subject us to painful medical procedures, and we teased one another affectionately using the word. And the teasing was a rite of passage into the community of cripples. This photo was taken in 1973 at the Carrie Sandahl Hospital for Crippled Children, taken pre-surgery. It shows me age 4, sitting in a chair, one orthopedic shoe visible, next to a girl about age 6, seated in a wheelchair, with her leg braces visible. In the background is a super cool girl with a fabulous bouffant hairdo at about age 10, seated in her wheelchair. My hair is blonde and my skin is so pale that the image is somewhat washed out, reflecting the camera's flash. The other 2 girls have brown skin and black hair. At the time, I thought of us all as crippled girls together, and I was unaware that our racial difference might have had any bearing on our experiences. The hospital was built near a Native American reservation and developed surgical techniques to treat polio patients, and was known for treating a congenital hip deformity that the Native Americans in the area were genetically predisposed to. I've started a research project about this hospital and how white settler colonialism and post-war politics affected the identity of the children who went to the hospital. But for this presentation, I must simplify the story to the fact that from my perspective, we were crippled girls having fun together in community. And then sometime in the 1970s and early 80s, the word cripple lost favor due to its association with social stigma. The medical facilities where my impairments were treated disappeared the word cripple from the names, as if changing the word would change disability stigma. During this time period, we cripples became more often labeled as handicapped Though the word cripple lost favor, the way the term was stricken from medical language, in a sense, I think, gave it more power to injure rather than less, because it was now a forbidden word. The word handicap, though, did signal more of a collectivity, because the word crippled is more often associated with people with orthopedic impairments, and handicaps seem to be more capacious. Okay, snapshot 2, terra incognita. I'm calling this period terra incognita, or unknown land, because as I grew older, I did not have any way of understanding my disability identity or even gender identity, as I was not treated by my peers or adults as other girls were. In the 1980s, I did not really have an association with other disabled kids in my small town community, since we were not the same age and there were so few of us. Like, I can remember one girl who had Down syndrome who was my age, a boy who was several years older than I was who used a wheelchair, and he and I never attended school at the same time. So those were my only disabled peers. My teen year, surgical hospitalizations were shorter in duration and less group-oriented. So I didn't even have short-term opportunities to bond with other disabled children like I did in my earliest years. As a high school, I was not teased for my impairment much, but I was always made aware that my disability disqualified me from dating or being sexually attractive as a young woman. I was the kind of kid who associated with people from many different cliques, but I felt most at home and spent most of my time with the theater kids. Though the theater kids existed in an identity terra incognita, our peers labeled us overtly by name calling, bullying, or more subtle forms of exclusion. Those who had it the worst were the kids suspected of being gay or lesbian. No one at the high school was out as gay or lesbian, even to themselves during this period. And to do so would have put a target on their back. So no one talked about it. No one knew of any adult who was out about being gay or lesbian. So the theater is where we weirdos, I think that just became the catch-all, found refuge, and we searched in role models with one another. We theater kids played with identity, taking it off and on like a costume in everyday life, as often as we changed costumes on stage. This slide has 3 photos of me with one of my best friends from high school, Paul. I want to talk a bit about my friendship with him as a means of illustrating how sexuality, gender, and disability formed a bond between us and were formative in complicating my own sense of identity. Paul was short, skinny, and a nonconformist who had a love of new wave music. He had a defiant asymmetrical haircut, and he was creative in his thrift store chic clothing. The first image shows the two of us sitting next to one another. The second shows us in a scene from a play, The Curious Savage, where he played a hospital orderly and I an eccentric elderly patient. And the third is a staged photo of us pretending to be lovers having a postcoital cigarette. We made ourselves look like we were naked in bed, which was just an illusion because we created it for the photo and the two of us were very much virgins and neither of us smoked. So I thought that this triptych would give you a sense of our humor, our affection for one another, and our careful cultivation of the general belief that he and I were romantically involved. Our assumed romance protected the both of us. How? Here's an example. One day, as Paul and I were walking to the lunchroom, a group of boys started taunting Paul, teasing him about his clothes and calling him a faggot and queer. We pretended like we couldn't hear them. And I reached for his hand and I smiled up at him with the best adoring girlfriend face I could possibly muster. And in that joining of hands, I protected him from taunts that might have escalated to physical violence. And he protected me from sexual disqualification and the shame that came along with it as a handicapped girl. Though Paul did not come out of the closet until his college years and never talked about being gay in high school, and I didn't talk really about being handicapped overtly, we both understood implicitly why we masqueraded this romance. Our performance of heterosexuality was just one of those fun, weirdo, theater kid things. And we improvised them continuously. This is just one example to protect ourselves from harm created by the identity vacuum of terra incognita. Snapshot 3, queer and queering. In the late 1980s, I was a theater student at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. There, I still lived in disability terra incognita, but the Americans with Disabilities Act had not yet passed. And there were only three, disabled people seem to come in threes in my stories. There were only three of us. There was me, a little person, and a wheelchair user. And we didn't know each other well, but we shared an unspoken solidarity by having furtive glances of acknowledgement when we would pass each other in the walkway. I was still able to navigate stairs leading to inaccessible classrooms and theater spaces at the small liberal arts college that I attended. I didn't need to ask for disability accommodations. And I was extremely lucky that my theater professors were forward-thinking enough to alter any physical barriers to the curriculum, such as those found in movement classes, so that I could participate and thrive. It was during my years at the university I learned to name my theater home as queer. This photo is from a production of Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, directed by one of my favorite professors, the outrageously queer theater artist, Diana Marie. The Comedy of Errors is a play infamous for its complicated plot twists, centering on the mistaken identities of not one, but two sets of identical twins, and their romantic entanglement with a pair of sisters, and an abbess who turns out to be the long-lost love of a duke. Lots of mistaken identities and lots of mayhem. And traditionally, the mayhem is resolved at the ending when everyone's identities are revealed and the appropriate heterosexual romantic dyads are established. Diana's production queered the play. It exaggerated the gender performances by adding characters in drag. In this photo, I'm playing a conjurer, an exorcist named Dr. Pinch, and I'm in male drag. Also pictured is the courtesan, a bearded male actor in female drag who was cross-cast as the hyper-macho Duke, and the sisters whose hair, costume, and makeup are exaggerated to the point that they are read as women in female drag. The drag, cross-gender casting, amped-up slapstick, and circus-informed design denaturalized heterosexuality from start to finish. In class, we learned about the Renaissance convention of male actors playing female roles and the ending's reinforcement of heterosexual gender norms. That might have been troubled if audiences of today knew that those female actors were originally played by men in drag. So even as the ending concludes, you're left with unsettled gender roles. We were also reading feminist and queer theater criticism that valued the potential of theater to upend gender norms. By using representational strategies such as exaggeration, unabashed artifice, and drag, supported by feminist and queer dramaturgy, Diana queered 20th century readings of Shakespeare's plays that tend to tame their radical potential to upend heterosexist norms. Diana was secure enough about her own identity to be out as a lesbian with her students. I learned from Diana about queerness as an anti-assimilationist politic and what the verb to queer meant as a representational strategy. By her very presence, as well as presence of out and queer classmates, I learned that performance offers not only a safe place to play with difference, but a safe place to be different and to deploy difference as a means of challenging social norms. Snapshot 4, Crip, cripping, queer, queering. I graduated from the University of Puget Sound in 1990, the same year that the Americans with Disabilities Act passed into law. Activists whom I'd never met or heard of during my high school and college undergraduate days had claimed minority status for disabled people and discarded the label handicapped. So I was no longer crippled or handicapped. I was now labeled and began to claim the term disabled or person with a disability. In the 1990s, as a theater graduate student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, I was able to connect with other disabled students through the work of the McBurney Disability Resource Center. This was the first time since early childhood that I found disability community rooted in mutual care. We provided academic accommodations, advocated for rights, named and spoke back to ableism. We began thinking about disability as identity, thought of disability in the context of feminist, queer, and critical race theories, made our own art, and told our own stories to each other and to the larger community. Along with the larger disability activist community, we decided that we were a culture, and we didn't care whether mainstream society believed us or not. We believed it. And we were disabled, we were creating disability culture, and we were proud. And like the cripples of hospital days, we developed really bad attitudes and snarky insider language. As well as becoming a disability activist, personal assistant for people with intellectual disabilities, and a theater scholar during those years, I was also deeply involved in making theater. Just like in my high school and college days, the theater was a relative safe haven for gay and lesbian people. Most of my friends were gay or lesbian, and the radical ones called each other queer. A couple of my best gay male friends, Dan Savage, you may have heard of him, and Peter McDowell, started our own theater company, and we went to gay bars and drag shows. My queer friends were activists in ACT UP, which is the acronym for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, a grassroots political group working to end the AIDS pandemic. My queer friends and I shared notes on disability activism and AIDS activism. At the time and in my social location, though, we were not thinking about disability and AIDS together, which is a mistake and a missed opportunity that's beyond the scope of this talk to unpack. And many of my disabled friends were also gay or lesbian, or were like myself, shall we say, unconventional in our sexuality. I often felt like I belonged more to the queer community than to disability community during these years. Upon reflection, I understand why. My queer friends distinguished themselves as more radical than the gay and lesbian communities of that time because their politics were anti-assimilationist on most issues like gay marriage, and they were less respectable socially by embracing drag and BDSM. So as a disabled person in graduate school, I found myself frequently at odds now with both the theater department and the disability activist community. For example, I opted out of participating in most of our departmental theater productions, finding that they often reinforced ableist values while purporting to have progressive politics. I also encountered for the first time being denied entry into classes I wanted to take because unlike my undergraduate days, I had professors who would not let me take their classes and were unwilling to see if they could be made accessible. I also found myself torn in allegiance to the disability community. For example, my disability activist friends organized a protest against the Jim Rose Circus Sideshow, a postmodern freak show, on the grounds that it exploited disability by its association with historical freak shows and because it featured a performer with dwarfism. But I, on the other hand, loved the Jim Rose Circus Sideshow, and I was even writing about them for my doctoral dissertation. So their protest threatened to shut down my research subject. They saw no value in the historical legacy of the freak show, nor its contemporary iteration. It became clear to me that I held beliefs and affinities that were more radical than my disabled peers. I found some of them frankly humorless and unimaginative. And as much as I dearly love them and credit them for their important activist work, I was less interested in some of the inspirational overcomers they invited to campus to raise consciousness on disability issues. Queer artists I was beginning to meet in the mid-90s, including Kenny Freeze, at National Disability Arts Gathering, gave me a sense that more was possible and that other disabled people found the same things funny that I did. So this slide includes 2 production photos from a play I directed. So I stopped doing university theater and I started making my own work. This was a play that I directed at the University of Wisconsin called Signs of Life by the playwright Joan Shankar. The play uses freakishness as a metaphor for the constructedness of femininity and heterosexuality. It tells the parallel story of Alice James, the lesbian sister of novelist Henry James, and Jane Merrick, a fictionalized version of John Merrick, the Elephant Man, and her exploitation by P.T. Barnum, Sideshow. The play queers the freak show by borrowing its tactic of violently turning disabled people into freaks to show how men violently feminize women through enforcement of feminine appearance and behavior. The photo on the left, I think it's the left this way. No, I guess it's the right. Stage left, stage right. You know what I mean. There's one photo of 2 guys. They are Henry James and P.T. Barnum toasting their tiny teacups in a moment of homosocial bonding over their triumphant control of the ladies. And the other photo shows my rendition of a kind of sideshow Greek chorus, including a man with a ridiculous fake leg where his penis should be, a woman with a tiny doll's head perched atop her own, and a bearded man in a dress. While this show gave me the opportunity to queer the feminine and the freak, I was ultimately left wanting to explore disability and freakishness, not as a metaphor for something else, but to explore disability and freakishness as lived experience in and of itself. So snapshot 5. This is where it all comes together, and queering the Crip and cripping the queer. So in 1998, I started my job at Florida State University School of Theater. I also found my way into relationship with disability activists whose politics embraced outsiderness and difference within disability community. These activists referred to themselves as Crips, a term familiar to me from having been a crippled child and from scholars and activists that I had met earlier. We referred to each other as Crip, a term that is shorthand for cripple, but has enough of a difference to be appealing to me. We also use the word as an adjective to describe disabled ways of being and doing that non-disabled people don't understand or simply don't recognize. I invoked the word Crip in my 2003 article to describe those at the radical edge of the disability community that expanded their critique of dominant culture from a bid for inclusion to a rejection of the terms of that inclusion. Yes, we want access and accommodations, but we also recognize that inclusion means little when the price of admission is the pain of recognizing that ableist structures do not change just because we're in the room. We are still outside, even when we're on the inside. We can't be our fabulous, kinky, crippled selves with bad attitudes when we are expected to be satisfied, and not just satisfied, but grateful for being let into a room, with the exception of this museum today, of course. I needed a word to describe disabled people who had snark, who did not want to blend in and stand out, which is where Crip comes in. So as you're going through the museum today, when that word Crip is invoked, it doesn't mean the same thing as disability. It stands for this whole layer of accrual and relationship, I think, to queerness. So during my years in Tallahassee, I became involved with the Mickey Faust Club, a theater for the weird community. So this for weird just also keeps coming up in relation. The company is led by deaf queer artist and her Terry Galloway, and her partner in life and art, Donna Nudd. The theater always included disabled people since its founding. This slide includes 2 production photos from a video short that we did called the Scary Lewis Yellathon, with an image of a DVD insert in the middle of a compilation of our wacky video parodies that pilloried beloved disability icons, including Helen Keller. The photo on this side shows me as Tiny Tina, who is the spoof of the charity poster child akin to Tiny Tim from Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And the other production photo shows Terry Galloway in drag as the infamous Jerry Lewis, who hosted the telethon for many years, along with KC Violette, who was playing another inspirational cripple with a talent to share with the world, and her overbearing stage mother. My work with Mickey Faust, sending up disability icons through techniques of drag and parodic exaggeration, inspired my coining of the verb to crip, to parallel the verb to queer. Both terms spin or hyperbolize to interrogate a phenomenon to point out oppressive norms. The term captures the insider-outsider nature of queer crip identities, affinities between queers and crips and their ways of looking at the world, snarky attitude, and anti-assimilationist politics. So just as in this exhibit, there are places where, crip can become more foregrounded or queer more foregrounded, places where they connect and places where they differ. So I created an n-gram from Google just for fun. If you haven't done this, you can put in a search term and see when how it goes into the Google analytics or algorithms, or I don't know the technical term, but you know what I'm talking about here. So in 2003, when I wrote the article and talked about to crip or cripping, that is down in here. All of the images on the line representing this use of the verb to crip, if I went in and actually looked at what they were referring to, they were either typos of the word crippling, like something is crippling, but they say cripping, or else it was some ancient use of the word, or it was used as a horse's bite, is a cripping. Anyway, so but the first time then crip was using it as a verb, I did find in my article, and then in 2006, Robert McRuer, the theorist, wrote a book called Crip Theory, Cultural Signs of Queerness and Disability. And in that book, he outlines a range of theories and social practices that take aim at the intersection between heterosexism and ableism, and imagines alternatives. So what I hope I've done today in this talk is to explain how crip differentiates from disability and why, how it's rooted deeply in lived experience, how that very power that was used to injure is re-articulated, and that power to injure remains. It's sort of like a fuck you back to society, but it's also a form of affection. It's just like queer is remobilized in similar ways. So I just wanted to end with just a couple of quick images from some of my more current work. So this is how I want to kind of explode that big picture image I showed you in the beginning, where you had disability, big picture in the middle with all the other identity formations that intersect with it. So since 2009, I have been working with Bodies of Work, which was an organization I had inherited from other disability activists and scholars. And the organization supports the development of new work by artists with disabilities. And we work in the Chicago area with individual artists and with organizations in creating pieces that don't reify some of the traditional kind of disability stories, but more importantly, they center the creation of new works based on the way that disabled people experience the world through our bodies, minds, and senses. So we have here dancers and musicians and performance artists, poets, photographers. The whole point is the work is not trying to fit in or to be adaptive in any way to non-disabled art forms, but to be something new based on how we experience the world. And we intentionally bring in people whose disability experiences represent the broader community in all of its variations. And then Kenny mentioned the film Code of the Freaks. That was released in March 2020 to great fanfare of everything being canceled. But it did live on in some online film festivals and is still making its way around. You can rent it on Amazon or other streaming services. But Code of the Freaks, and I have some production photos here and also the publicity poster, is a documentary that Crips and queers Hollywood representations of disability. So you can see in the images here some of that same aesthetic that I've kind of cultivated over time. We have interviewees, and in the background of the interviewees is distorted images from the Hollywood movies that we're critiquing, and they're hyperbolized, they're grotesque. It was a nightmare getting the permissions to use all this footage, or the legal permissions. But as long as we were taking the images and directly linking them with critique, it fell under fair use. But the film brings together Crip activists, scholars, and artists to critique Hollywood stereotype and the use of disability as a pervasive metaphor for overcoming and as a narrative device for inspiring moral change in non-disabled people. So we make art out of our community of spectatorship. So this is a representational strategy of beginning with disability community and how we mercilessly mock these movies and making that itself a piece of art. So it's a spinning again around and making the work the reception rather than the creation of the Hollywood film. So it's bidirectional. I like to call it representational retribution on the part of disabled people. So the film is framed by our reclaiming of the 1932 film Freaks by Todd Browning. The film features a cast of freak show performers who defend themselves against murderous, non-disabled villains. Their code of the freaks is a tagline, which is, "You offend one and you offend them all," which we embrace as our call to arms. So you offend one of us, we're all gonna get you. That's basically where we go with the movie. So in conclusion, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey, backwards and forwards, tracing the terms and concepts that the exhibition here explores. I hope my story serves as an invitation to position yourselves in relationship to the histories that it takes up and to the individual artists that the exhibition features. So any one of us could tell a similarly complex story, and that all of those stories taken together form that larger, complicated disability picture. The word cripple, its power to diagnose, harm, and exclude, holds potential in its reclamation to gather disability community and hold space for the paradox of demands for inclusion, as well as the recognition of the power of difference. So there's no way to reconcile these two poles. There's no way to demand inclusion on the terms of the mainstream while at the same time maintaining outsider. So it's constantly weaving in and out and shape-shifting. And you'll see that so much in the exhibition. So if disability means something and everything, we need to pay attention to how Crips and queers call each other in and call each other out, continue to work in coalition, celebrate each other, and most of all, protect each other from the harms of ableism, snark included. Thank you. think we needed to take a break for the interpreters. 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Yeah, thanks to the interpreter who was here doing this, holding on her own. It was amazing. Thank you. And just take a 5-minute break and then, yeah, especially would welcome some ideas about the exhibit.
And I'm going to stay here so I don't have to knock things over. It was really interesting for me to watch Carrie do this because Terry Galloway and I went to graduate school together. It's just how these things go around. So we could now open up for questions or comments that you have for Carrie, and if you don't have them, then we're gonna have to make some up. So please have some. I'm too tired to make questions up. So anyone have any questions or comments for Carrie? Yeah. Pharrell. Should we pass the mic over now? They got it.
Hi, Carrie. I'm volunteering in order to kick off the questions. I feel like I'm not shy, and I'm not shy to ask you things. So then I hope it opens up the room to not be shy to ask you things. I really appreciated the personal instances that you used from your life to highlight the points that you were making. And it really helped me to understand myself better as well, and in ways that also do contradict each other, and that I actually always feel either frustration or shame about as a queer Crip, thinking that these identities should always be working together, and that the identities of other Crips or other queers should also always cooperate with each other. And so one thing that stands out to me is this instance of you appreciating this play about the freak show based on your own queerness, and how you also were wanting to experiment with Cripness in your own work, and how incredibly brave it was for you to actually stand apart from your disabled community at that time to say, actually, there's an aesthetic here that's mine, and I'm going to claim this, and I'm going to write something to show you. And then how that like fast forwards into Code of the Freaks now, how you're still kind of trying to flip this language and spectatorship like back on itself. But it takes a lot of strength to be able to do that and not be misread or alienate your own people. And I was wondering if you wanted at all to talk about the alienation part of things and how you relate to that and have worked with it.
Thank you for that. I think as I've gotten older, I've really come to understand that paradoxes are exactly where you need to go with your work, things that are fundamentally incompatible but somehow hang together. And as I was sitting here looking at Anne Finger while I was talking, her book, Past Due, which talks about the tensions and disability and feminist communities, was one of the first books I found as I was coming to my own disability identity. And it was incredibly important for me because Anne, in that book, articulated a lot of the tensions I felt as a disabled woman in feminist circles and discourse. So there are lots of these pockets where other disabled people have identified them, but I'm staunchly still feminist, but also feel and have felt alienated from disability community, but it doesn't mean that I'm not both. And when I was looking at the solo performance artists, what I found so intriguing about them is how they could speak to crowds of mixed groups of people and had the authority to lovingly critique the groups that they belong to in the same room. So and I'm a person who likes to be liked. So it's very hard to be sometimes polarizing. But I think that learning to be, that being liked is a survival strategy that disabled people have, and it's something that I recognize is a performance strategy. So especially if you've spent many hours as a disabled child who is, immobilized in body casts and relying for a nurse's favorable attention to give you pain medication or keep you company, it's a performance skill. So it feels very vulnerable to not have people like you in all instances, but to be able to be an activist, you have to be able to hang with that. And I'm always trying in my work and in my activism to hold space for paradox. And I'm finding that more and more difficult now. I mean, I think during the pandemic and some of the call out culture, which I participate in, I'm not going to say I don't, but we don't have very many ways for people to find connections, and that's something that I'm hoping that exhibitions like the one here are holding space for too. Is as you make your way through the exhibit, you can find lots of points of contradiction, and finding that as productive, because we all want neat narratives. If you want a neat narrative, go to the Hollywood movies. They resolve it all for you. And the way, to challenge those means you have to sit in a lot of contradictions. So yeah, it's an uneasy place, but also I think if you are not able to stay in those places of contradiction, then you get lonely really fast, right? Yeah.
Shut it off. Others? You don't really need to have that. Yeah, Noah?
Hi, Carrie. I do have a question that goes specifically because I really liked how you also brought your own history together with how the history of the term, especially to Crip, came about, but also Crip as a self-identification. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about this question of kind of the access to this terminology in terms of, because I use these words for myself or my practices, and I have an answer for myself, but I know that a lot of people often have this question of, but am I allowed to call myself Crip or my practice cripping, especially when I'm not this person with a visible orthopedic disability for whom the term cripple might have been used for. And I was wondering, okay, on your journey, did you also discover these discussions in the past or even today, especially when it comes to people with more invisibilized disabilities, like neurodivergent people, chronically ill people? And if you could say something, to that for, who's this term for?
That's a really good question. And I don't think that I am the one that can decide that. I think everyone needs to, who's interested in the term, can position themselves around it. I don't think it's necessarily something you have to be. It can be a position that you try on. It can be a perspective. It can be a theory. I think the key, though, is as we're taking different perspective taking, having a recognition of the grounding and lived experience. So Perel, talked about my queer identity, and I'm putting that in quotes because for me, that's also a position that I'm not sure that I can claim. It depends on whose definition you're using. And, what is it defined by? Particular practices? Is it by sexual relationship partners? Is it non-normative sexuality? I mean, so like, do I have to drill down to exactly what I do in the bedroom before I could say that I'm queer? So to me, I think of that as analogous for people claiming Crip. It's not, neither of these terms can perfectly capture an identity or a way of being or a perspective. It's kind of turn taking and acknowledgement of, in any instance, how you're using the term. That is a lot of mental gymnastics and not very accessible, but it's the best I can come up with. I invite you to think through your own relationships to some of these terms. For me, one of the most difficult collaborations and painful ones is this question around claiming Crip and working with people, collaborating with artists with intellectual disability. A lot of the Crip aesthetic relies on parody, and parody requires consent, right? Because when you parody something, you trash it by inhabiting it so grotesquely that it becomes noticeable. But it's a kind of violence, and when you are performing parody, you don't replace it with anything. So in Code of the Freaks, when we have audience Q&As, audiences want to know, well, what movie do you like? Isn't there any movie? Like, they demand that we come up with a fix to Hollywood's problem. I'm like, no, our job is we just exposed how the narratives work. We're cripping the narratives, but it doesn't mean that it's also our job to replace all of them in the same movie. It's like people expect certain things to do everything all the time. And so in Mickey Faust Club, we'd had a collaboration with 3 folks with intellectual disabilities in a game show parody that we had. And it was kind of like a reality TV show. And the folks with intellectual disabilities participated with us in the writing of the script, in performing. The plot involved a lot of comic violence toward disabled people. We were all making fun of our own impairments, and they were making fun of their own impairments. And we thought we were having the best time, and what a great collaboration. Then we had a premiere of that video compilation, the DVD, the GIMP Parade. And the folks with ID were there with their guardians. None of them were their own guardians, so they weren't legally had the same rights as other consenting adults. And so when the clip came on that they were involved with, it was like putting a turd in a punch bowl. Like the guardians were furious. They were so angry, and we were like, it was like a red carpet event. We were wearing like fancy clothes, and they beelined to us and they said, "How dare you make fun of my relative? How dare you make fun of people with intellectual disability?" And we were shocked. We're like, we were collaborating. This was consensual. But then the guardians they banded together, and the folks with ID then were shamed, and they came to say that they weren't consenting to the representation, and then they threatened to sue us. So what we ended up having to do is we had to re-edit the whole video with these animated smiley faces over top of them. But that was probably the most painful fracture of disability community I had ever experienced. But it also made me really aware of the inaccessibility of this kind of representation, what it means to consent to forms of self-representation or community. When you're representing a whole community, what responsibilities are to all of the ways that people are made vulnerable by representation that you might recognize. We had no idea that this would blow up like that. The unfortunate fallout was that I didn't collaborate again with people under guardianship until very, very recently. And because I was afraid of this happening again, but then I realized mostly my graduate students challenged me on this because they were very interested in these collaborations. And so we found ways to, reach across and work with guardians. It challenges your notions of independence as disabled people too, right? If you're working with guardians and people with intellectual disability, where's the collaboration? Is it disability-led anymore when you start to involve non-disabled guardians? So this is what I mean. This way of taking experiences and bringing them up against one another, revising what you know. And I think that example was probably the most painful one, but there are lots of instances when, you stand up and you speak for a community and unintentionally harm people in the process. But can you say something with bite and with verb or snark without hurting someone? Some of these terms are meant to injure. When we had the showing of the GIMP parade at Victory Gardens Theater in Chicago, when I first moved there, we had another opening where the whole disability community was invited at a Q&A like this one. A man with cerebral palsy took the mic and he was furious with us. He said, "You don't speak for us. This is the worst piece of shit I have ever seen. I can't believe that you're doing." He called us out like in front of the whole audience, and it was awkward to say this, but I thanked him. It's like, well, tell me, like, what was that experience for you? What's happening for you? And so then he was, shared what his perspective was. And that to me was an outcome. That was a positive thing that he felt like a space was held for him to be furious with us. And his explanation of why was a beautiful way of articulating the danger of this kind of representation for him. So that's the beauty, I think, of theater and performance and gatherings, is that when we're able to hold space for dissent and for argument, then something new can come out of it. But it's not always pretty. And sometimes you fail spectacularly. And that's the something in everything, right?
Anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, I'm a bit nervous. My name is Ana Jara. I'm from Brazil. I'm seeing where I come from, so that the question, or like curiosity, I wouldn't even say it's a question in the sense that I'm not looking for specific answers, but I have been thinking about the intersection between disability and colonialism for a while now. And then I remember that at the beginning of the talk, you told about this hospital with the Crip kids, and that some were Native American. And my question, because I ask always when I have the opportunity, I ask about this, not only from a kind of prejudice level, like, oh, were the doctors treating them differently, but also the way that they saw their disability, if you felt that there was something different because of culture, because of cultural background, and yeah.
Well, I was so young, I had no awareness. But when I look at all the photos of my time in the hospital, I'm the only white person. But it didn't occur to me. And you start asking questions and doing some investigation. The hospital is no longer, it's in a town called Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. Yeah. And it's was named after the game show Truth or Consequence. I had a section I had to cut out, but that's my next project. Right, so the town was called Warm Springs, and the hospital was established by Governor Tingley, who was a friend of FDR. And it was a Warm Springs hospital based on the one in Georgia. And it treated polio patients and developed surgical techniques there. But they also put the hospital there because of this Native American community that had this congenital hip deformity. So I'm curious about that. And since the hospital moved to Albuquerque and no longer has the name crippled in it at all, you have to search around to understand, oh, this is an orthopedic hospital. A lot of that history gets erased. Like I had to do a lot of digging, and there's been some reunions of the hospital workers that I didn't find out about until I started doing some research. But I have a lot of questions. And when you read the accounts and there's mentions of this Native American community, the narrative is how it's kind of a white savior narrative, like that the hospital came and they developed treatments for this community that was underserved and helped a lot of kids. And I'm sure they helped a lot of kids, and I'm sure it was exploitative. I'm really curious to find out. But I've written an article about a little bit about this history, where I've been thinking about how our bodies are archives of these practices. So just like this paper that I shared with you today, these thoughts are kind of like an undigging or rifling through an archive. Our bodies, even our physical manifestation of our bodies, are archival of previous practices. So my body holds the surgeries, like the literal techniques that they used to move my bones and shape my body, were perfected on Native American kids and polio patients. So there was like polio patients and kids with this hip condition. So the polio epidemic is an archive in my body because the techniques, surgical techniques, were created on polio patients. So in a way, our disability community webs, like our bodies are archives of each other. Language and metaphor, but also literal, right? Our literal shapes. And I'm really curious about colonialism as part of that and these narratives. So the truth or consequences, it also really deeply affected my aesthetics, because truth or consequences was based on, well, there was a contest for different communities to bid to have the game show in their community. And if they named their town after the game show and became their living advertisement, they would get yeah, $10,000. They got some amount of money. But as a result, they would have parades and events sponsored by the game show. So when I was in the hospital, I have all these like vague, probably drug-induced memories of these wacky carnivalesque kind of performers that would come in, and parades and weird game show stuff. So like there's like, I have weird game show mixed when I was in a community with Native American kids. Like, does any of this make sense at all? No wonder I'm like so confused. But it's really curious to me, and that's an act of, you know, exploitive capitalism. Name your town after our game show and be our living advertisement in perpetuity. It's still there. So those kind of capitalism, white settler colonialism, all of those are one big mix. But how do you talk about all of that at the same time? It's a continual question I have. Are we at time, Kenny?
Well, time for more. I just wanted to say something. It's when I hear you talk about this, I think of what Adrienne Rich, her definition of poetry was two or more things that you don't think of as being simultaneous put together. So, yeah. One more, maybe time for one more question, or a comment that anyone has, or we could just call it a night. Anyone? Going, gone. Okay. Well, thank you, Carrie, immensely. And just want to let people know that on Saturday at 4 p.m., Perel will be performing, what are we calling it? A ritual intervention called, I'm going to get it wrong because it's late. Is it death loops and desire lines? Did I get it right? Or is it the reverse? It's desire lines and death loops. Okay, there we go. At 4 o'clock, not to be missed. And then on November 23rd, Cyrus Marcus Ware, who has a work in the show, will be here from Canada, talking about the relationship between Black activism and art. And then on December 3rd, we haven't gotten the exact, it's the International Day of the Disabled. We'll be doing an event with German artists, right, Kate? Yeah, Kate's doing that one. So just, and if you haven't seen the exhibit, do see the exhibit. If you've seen the exhibit, see it many more times. And tell everyone you know. And thanks again for being here. And thanks again, Carrie.
Thank you.